All right, so practice problem number 1 for chapter 19. And this exercise here that you see on the screen is in regards to recording materials, labor, and overhead. And in the middle of the screen, we're provided the information from the company in regards to the raw materials that were purchased on credit. So they give us that amount. They also give us the amounts for direct materials and labor that were used. And they let us know that the overhead rate, so factory overhead rate, is applied by taking 120% of direct labor costs. And so our job is to prepare journal entries to record the raw materials that were purchased, direct materials and direct labor that were used, and also the applied overhead into the company's books. So I'm going to go ahead and just uh, prepare a partial general journal here. I'm just going to put on here account on the right hand side and DR for debit, CR for credit. Okay. So for number 1, it says it says prepare the journal entries to record raw materials purchased. Okay. So it lets us know that the raw materials right here was purchased on credit for $76,200. So since raw materials was acquired on credit, we're going to go ahead and debit raw materials inventory for $76,200. So this is specifically an inventory account, which means that since raw materials was purchased, that means that this is going to be an increase in inventory, which means that debiting it is increasing the balance in that account. So I'm going to draw an arrow right next to the $76,200. And it lets us know that the materials were purchased on credit, which means that the other account that is affected is going to be accounts payable. And that's our liability account. So we're going to credit that account for $76,200. And that's also increasing the balance in that liability account. So that's number 1. Number 2, direct materials that were used. So direct materials used. So we have to record an entry reflecting direct materials that were used. Okay. So for this entry here, we're going to have to first figure out how we're going to show that direct materials that the company already has we can say in their warehouse was used up. Well, to reflect the usage of direct materials, we're just going to go ahead and credit raw materials. Let me go ahead and put it over here. Raw materials inventory for $48,000. Okay. So out of the raw materials that were acquired on credit of $76,200, we used up, or the company used up $48,000 of it. So we have to credit that account. And since it is an inventory account, it is an asset account. Crediting that account is going to decrease the balance in that account. Okay. Now, since direct materials were used during this process here, direct materials, or raw materials in this case, were transferred over to what is called work in process inventory account for $48,000. So we're going to debit that account. We're just going to increase the balance in this inventory account. Now, one thing to note here in regards to raw materials inventory and work in process inventory accounts, these two accounts are not accounts that you will see in a company's financial statements, specifically in the balance sheet. This is just these are internal accounts. So only employees, so people within the business or working within the business, are going to be able to and have access to this type of information, will be the only ones that are able to see these two different types of accounts. But if you look at the balance sheet, so let's just say if a company furnishes their financial statements publicly, and you look at the balance sheet and you see the inventory balance, that inventory balance, it's just going to be a one lump sum. It's not going to be separated out by raw materials or work in process or finished goods. It's not going to be separated out like that. You're just going to see inventory or inventory net amount. Okay, so again, just so you know, raw materials and work in process, these two type of account descriptions are for internal purposes, but it is going into ultimately the inventory account. Okay, so for number two, we have pretty much one inventory account going down and another one going up. That's all. So you're just moving things around, shifting things around from one inventory account to another. Okay, so what's happening here? Let me zoom out if I can. There we go. What is happening here for number two is that you're taking out raw materials from that account and you moving it into the work in process inventory account, because those are materials that you're using in order to produce some finishing product or products, plural. So for number three, we got direct labor used. So direct labor used, it tells us that's $15,350. So since direct labor was used, we're going to go ahead and credit factory wages payable. And we're crediting that account for $15,350. That's going to increase the balance in that account because that is a liability account. So think of factory wages payable as direct labor, because that's direct labor that was used. So these are assembly workers that actually are directly involved in the process of producing products. Okay, so since they're involved in producing the products, the account that's going to be debited is going to be work in process. Okay, work in process for 15,350, and that's going to increase. Okay, so you just acknowledging or identifying that wages will need to be paid, and it's going to be wages are need to be paid out to the assembly workers, and it needs to be included in the work in process inventory account. Okay, so direct materials and direct labors, when those are being used, it's being transferred or being recorded to work in process inventory accounts. Okay, so that's number three. And then lastly, number four, applied overhead. So we are going to have to record overhead. Now the overhead rate, they let us know that it is 120% of direct labor costs. So if I take 120% of direct labor costs, which is 15,350, that's going to give us $18,420. So that's our factory overhead. So for factory overhead, we're going to go ahead and credit factory overhead for 18,420. Okay, and so since it is part of the process of producing the finishing product or finishing products, plural, we're going to go ahead and debit work in process again. Work in process inventory for that same amount. Okay, so factory overhead is established, is applied to work in process inventory.